The Book of Ruth is one of the most beautiful and profound narratives in the Bible, not because of its length or drama, but because of its quiet, unfolding power. It's only 4 chapters long, but it carries a timeless message about loyalty, love, redemption, and God's divine providence, even in ordinary life. Set during the chaotic time of the Judges, when everyone did what was right in his own eyes, Ruth's story offers a contrast, a story of faithfulness, moral courage, and God's redemptive work behind the scenes. The story begins with tragedy. In Ruth 1, we meet Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons who leave Bethlehem, a town whose name means house of bread because of famine. They settle in Moab, a foreign and pagan land. There, the sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. But within a decade, all the men, Elimelech and both sons, are dead, leaving 3 widows in a society that had little protection for women without male providers. Naomi, hearing that the famine in Bethlehem has ended, decides to return home. Here we see the first major theme, God's providence during suffering. Though Naomi is bitter, saying the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me, God is already orchestrating her restoration through Ruth. Often in seasons of loss or despair, we cannot see what God is preparing, but this book reminds us. Even in the dark, God is moving. On the journey back to Judah, Naomi urges her daughters-in-law to return to their families. Orpah tearfully leaves, but Ruth clings to Naomi and utters some of the most famous words in Scripture. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. This powerful declaration of loyalty marks the beginning of Ruth's conversion to the God of Israel. She leaves behind her homeland, culture, and gods. This teaches us the depth of covenantal loyalty, not just between people, but toward God. Ruth, a foreigner, becomes a model of unwavering commitment. When Naomi and Ruth arrive in Bethlehem, it's barley harvest season. In Ruth 2, Ruth goes to glean in the fields to provide for them. According to Levitical law, landowners were to leave the edges of their fields for the poor and foreigners to glean from. Ruth just so happens to glean in the field of Boaz, a wealthy and godly man from Elimelech's family. This is not coincidence, it's divine arrangement. The text subtly teaches us that God's hand is often hidden in ordinary moments. What seems like a random encounter is really God's providence at work. Boaz notices Ruth, and after learning about her kindness to Naomi, he offers her protection, food, and favor. He tells her, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz represents a Christ-like figure, offering shelter, favor, and blessing to the outsider who trusts in God. He also fulfills the law of hospitality and care for the vulnerable, which was central to Israelite identity. In Ruth 3, Naomi encourages Ruth to approach Boaz at the threshing floor, a bold, culturally loaded move. She is essentially asking Boaz to take on the role of a kinsman redeemer, a goel, someone who, under Deuteronomical law, had the responsibility to marry a deceased relative's widow and preserve the family line. Ruth humbly lays at Boaz's feet and says, "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian." This symbolic action reflects a deep request for protection, marriage, and restoration. Boaz is moved by her kindness and purity, and agrees, but informs her that there's a closer relative who has the first right of redemption. Again, this reveals Boaz's integrity. He is not impulsive he acts righteously and honors the law. This chapter teaches the importance of honor, patience, and doing things God's way, even when shortcuts are tempting. In Ruth 4, Boaz meets the closer relative at the town gate where legal matters were resolved. When the relative declines, Boaz steps in, purchasing the land of Elimelech and taking Ruth as his wife. Their union is blessed, and Ruth gives birth to a son named Obed, who becomes the grandfather of King David. This final chapter is filled with redemption not only for Ruth and Naomi, but for Israel and the world. Through Ruth, a Moabite outsider, God brings forth the royal line that would eventually lead to Jesus Christ. Key teachings from the Book of Ruth. God is always working behind the scenes, even in our pain. Ruth begins with loss and despair, but ends in redemption and joy. When life feels empty, God may be preparing to fill us in ways we never imagined. Loyalty, faith, and kindness matter more than status or heritage. Ruth was a foreigner, but her character and commitment stood out. In God's kingdom, faithfulness is greater than background. God uses ordinary people and small choices to shape history. Ruth and Boaz were not kings or warriors, but their faithfulness made them part of God's redemptive plan for all humanity. Boaz is a picture of Christ. He protects, redeems, and honors Ruth, just as Jesus redeems and restores those who trust in him. Our pain does not have the final word. Naomi, once bitter, holds her grandson in the end. The story is a reminder that God restores what is lost and gives more than we imagined. Why Ruth still matters today? The Book of Ruth reminds us that God sees us, especially when we feel unseen. Whether you're facing hardship, navigating loss, or just wondering if your small acts of faith even matter. Ruth shows that God honors those who remain faithful, even in obscurity. It is a story that proves that God's plan can move through quiet obedience, just as powerfully as through dramatic miracles. Ruth encourages us to be faithful in the field we've been given, to treat others with loyalty and honor, and to trust that God is working, even when we can't see it yet. And ultimately, it points us to Jesus, the Redeemer who welcomes the outsider, restores the broken, and gives us a new name and future.